It started with a single, unexplainable event. Every clock in the town of Hawthorne stopped at exactly 3:33 a.m. At first, no one thought much of it, but by morning, the town's streets were eerily silent. Doors were left wide open, meals half-eaten, cars abandoned in the middle of the road. Every single resident, over 2,000 people, had vanished without a trace. The strangest part, their shadows remained, burned into the ground as if by a nuclear blast. The only witness to what happened that night was a drifter named Marcus, and he was never the same again. Marcus wasn't supposed to be in Hawthorne. He was just passing through, a man running from his past, hopping from town to town. That night, he'd sought shelter in an old, abandoned barn on the outskirts of the sleepy town. The air had been thick with the scent of rain, and the distant hum of cicadas was the only sound accompanying him as he drifted to sleep. But at precisely 3:33 a.m., he was jolted awake by a sound unlike anything he'd ever heard, a deep, guttural hum that resonated through his chest, as if the earth itself were groaning in agony. His first thought was an earthquake, but nothing shook. Instead, the barn was illuminated by an unearthly light, cold, white, and searing. Peeking through a crack in the wooden walls, Marcus saw it, a massive, pulsating sphere of light hovering above the town square. It pulsed like a heartbeat, casting shadows in every direction. Then, he noticed the figures in the street. Townsfolk stood frozen in place, staring up at the orb, their faces locked in expressions of awe and terror. Marcus's instincts screamed at him to run, but something held him there, something he couldn't explain. As he watched, the light seemed to grow brighter, its hum louder. The people began to move, but not of their own accord. Their bodies lifted into the air like marionettes on invisible strings, their shadows remaining burned into the ground where they once stood. One by one, they disappeared into the sphere. Then silence. The next morning, Marcus stumbled into the empty streets of Hawthorne. It was as if time had stopped. Dogs roamed aimlessly, cars sat idle, and the air carried a strange, metallic tang. The only sign of the townsfolk were their shadows, perfectly etched into the asphalt and walls, each frozen in place like a snapshot of their last moment. Desperate for answers, Marcus tried to leave town, but every road out of Hawthorne led him back to its center. It was as if the town itself refused to let him go. Days passed, though it was impossible to track time. The clocks never moved, and the sun never fully rose. It hung in a perpetual twilight, casting long, eerie shadows that seemed to reach for Marcus when he wasn't looking. That's when he began to hear the whispers. They started as faint murmurs, barely audible over the oppressive silence. But as the days dragged on, they grew louder, more insistent. Voices spoke in a language Marcus didn't recognize, but their tone was unmistakable. They were pleading, warning, and accusing all at once. At night, he saw movement in the corners of his vision, dark, human-like shapes that melted into the shadows when he turned to face them. One night, as he sat in the middle of the town square, desperate and delirious, the whispers coalesced into a single clear sentence. "You should not have stayed." Marcus realized the shadows were not mere imprints. They were alive, fragments of the people who had vanished. They were trapped, tethered to the town, and they wanted out. One shadow, smaller than the rest, began following Marcus closely. It mimicked his movements, its form more solid than the others. When he finally summoned the courage to speak to it, it responded by pointing to the clock tower. The tower loomed over the town, its hands frozen at 3:33. Inside, Marcus discovered an old journal belonging to the town's mayor. The entries grew increasingly erratic, detailing strange occurrences. Lights in the sky, disappearances of livestock, and nightmares shared by the entire town. The final entry read, "It's here. We've been chosen. Do not fight it." Beneath the journal lay a map with a single word scrawled across it in red ink. Sacrifice. Determined to break free, Marcus climbed to the top of the tower, where he found a peculiar machine humming faintly. Its design was unlike anything human. gleaming metal etched with symbols that seemed to shift when he looked away. Instinctively, he reached for the controls, and the whispers grew deafening, begging him to stop. But Marcus had no choice. He turned the machine off. The moment he did, the orb of light reappeared, but this time it was angry. The hum became a deafening roar, and the shadows writhed in agony. Marcus ran, the ground shaking beneath his feet as the town began to collapse in on itself. He awoke miles away, on the side of a highway, with no memory of how he got there. Hawthorne was gone, erased from every map and memory, as if it had never existed. But Marcus knew the truth. He could feel it every night as he tried to sleep. The faint, persistent hum, growing louder with each passing day. And sometimes, when he looked at the wall, he saw a shadow that wasn't his own. And now, as you sit there in the comfort of your home, look around. Are your shadows where they should be? Because if they're not, it might already be too late. As weeks passed, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that he was being followed. No matter where he went, no matter how far he traveled, that low, insistent hum never stopped. It was faint at first, like the sound of distant thunder on a quiet night. But over time, it grew louder, more insistent. At night, when he lay in bed, it seemed to come from the walls, the floor, the air itself. Sometimes, when he awoke in the middle of the night, his room would be colder than it should have been. He'd glance toward the window, and for a brief, terrifying moment, he'd see it. A figure standing motionless in the shadows, its outline only barely visible. He'd blink, and it would be gone, but he knew it was still there, watching. The nightmares came next. At first, they were simple, flashes of light, distant voices calling his name. But soon, they became more vivid. In these dreams, Marcus was back in Hawthorne, standing in the middle of the town square. The streets were empty, the buildings dark, but the air was thick with something that made his skin crawl. And then he'd hear them, the whispers. The voices, faint at first, would start to speak to him again, but this time, they were different. They no longer begged for freedom. They didn't plead for mercy. They were angry, accusing. They told him that he had betrayed them, that by turning off the machine in the clock tower, he had sealed their fate. "You freed us only to bind us to this world forever," they whispered, their voices like nails scraping against metal. "Now you will never escape. You will never be free." And then the shadows would move. It wasn't until one cold, rainy evening, when Marcus had all but given up on escaping, that he saw it. He was sitting in his dimly lit apartment, staring out the window, trying to drown out the gnawing feeling of being watched. The hum had become unbearable, like the pulse of a dying heart, and the shadow that followed him had grown bolder, appearing in the corner of his vision at all hours. But this time, it was different. He had just gone to the bathroom to splash water on his face when he caught a glimpse of something in the mirror. For a moment, he thought it was his own reflection, but then he realized it wasn't. There, in the glass, standing directly behind him, was a figure. Its features were blurred, formless, but its eyes, they were the same eyes as the townsfolk from Hawthorne. Dark, hollow, and full of regret. It was as if the person standing behind him was not quite human, not quite alive. And yet, he felt its presence in the pit of his stomach, as if it were something that shouldn't be. Before he could react, the shadow in the mirror moved. Its hand reached out and touched the surface of the glass, and as it did, the reflection of Marcus began to fade, as if it were being pulled into the glass. For a split second, he saw his own face, contorted in terror, disappear entirely. Marcus stumbled back, gasping for breath, his heart racing. He turned to face the mirror again, but there was nothing, just his own wide-eyed reflection. But the hum, it was louder than ever. Marcus could no longer ignore it. He knew that Hawthorne had never truly disappeared. It was still there in some twisted, forgotten corner of the world. It existed in the spaces between moments, lurking just beyond the veil of reality. And the people, the souls of the vanished townsfolk, They were still trapped, their shadows bound to the town, forced to haunt anyone who ventured too close to their cursed home. One night, unable to sleep, Marcus found himself back in the woods outside Hawthorne, his feet carrying him toward the heart of the town. He didn't know why. He didn't want to go back, but something pulled at him, a force far stronger than his own will. He had no choice but to follow. When he reached the old barn where he had first witnessed the lights, he saw it. The orb. It floated just above the ground, its light a cold, merciless glow that lit up the trees in sharp, jagged shadows. The humming sound was almost deafening now, and he could feel the presence of the lost souls. Thousands of them surrounding him, their eyes watching, accusing. Marcus didn't hesitate. He walked straight into the orb of light, knowing that it was the only way to end this madness. As he crossed the threshold, everything around him began to spin. The ground shook, and the hum reached a fever pitch, deafening him. His vision blurred, and in the chaos, he heard a voice, faint but clear. You can never leave once you've been chosen. The world around Marcus collapsed into a blinding white light, and when it faded, he found himself standing in the middle of the town square once again. But this time, it was different. The buildings were intact, the streets alive with movement, the air full of life. Yet, there was a sense of wrongness in everything. The people moved like puppets, their eyes hollow, their smiles too wide, too perfect. The shadow of a man appeared in front of him, the same figure he had seen in his reflection. It was not the mayor, not a fellow townsperson, no. This was something far older, far darker, a figure that stretched back through the centuries, tied to the town, to the very fabric of existence itself. You were the one who freed us, Marcus, the shadow whispered. But in doing so, you became one of us. Marcus' heart raced as the truth hit him. The shadows of Hawthorne were not merely trapped. They had been waiting for anyone, to bring them back into the world. They were parasites, feeding on the souls of the living, consuming their energy until nothing remained but hollow shells. And now, Marcus was one of them. The light began to fade again, and the whispers returned, louder than ever. He tried to scream, to run, but it was too late. His body felt heavy, his limbs stiff, as the shadows surrounded him, pulling him into the darkness. He felt his very essence being drained, his soul torn from his body. And as he was swallowed by the darkness, Marcus realized with horror that he had never truly escaped Hawthorne. He had become part of it, forever. So, the next time you pass through a sleepy town, remember this. Some places aren't meant to be found, and sometimes the darkness you run from is already following you